Throughout history, you'll find that women who lived without husbands held considerable power and autonomy. From Rome's Vestal virgins who maintained 30-year chastity vows while possessing inalienable rights, to medieval London's femmes souls who operated as independent brewers, silk workers and textile merchants with full jurisdiction over their earnings. The term spinster originally denoted a respectable profession, providing complete economic self-determination. And understanding this forgotten history reveals how cultural narratives systematically erased these contributions. Although marriage represented the expected social destiny for women across most ancient civilizations, a distinct class of priestesses deliberately rejected matrimonial bonds to fulfill sacred obligations that society deemed incompatible with domestic life. You'll find that Rome's Vestal virgins, established around 717 BCE under King Numa Pompilius, maintained 30-year vows of chastity while guarding the sacred flame of Vesta, enjoying inalienable rights that included freedom from paternal jurisdiction and the authority to own property independently. In ancient Greece, the Pythia at Delphi exercised remarkable autonomy, delivering prophecies that influenced political and military decisions across the Mediterranean world. These women occupied positions where the nullification of traditional female roles became not merely acceptable, but spiritually mandated, demonstrating that societies recognized certain sacred duties transcended conventional expectations of wifehood and motherhood. In medieval London, guild records from the 1300s document femmes souls working as brewers, silk workers and textile merchants, exercising inalienable rights to sue, be sued, and accumulate wealth independently. This economic autonomy, however, faced systematic nullification upon marriage, creating a stark choice between romantic partnership and financial self-determination that shaped countless women's decisions throughout the medieval period. Before the term acquired its modern pejorative connotations, spinster designated women who spun thread and yarn for a living, a textile occupation that provided genuine economic independence throughout medieval and early modern Europe. You'll find that spinning represented one of the few professions where women exercised complete jurisdiction over their labour, materials and earnings without male oversight. In England's 1377 poll tax records, spinsters appear as independent taxpayers, demonstrating their recognised economic status within legal frameworks. The profession's inalienable rights to self-employment meant you could work from home, set your own hours, and accumulate personal wealth. Colonial America's legal framework granted femme sole status to unmarried women, allowing them property rights, contract authority, and court access that married women wouldn't possess until the 19th century's Married Women's Property Acts began their slow nullification of coverture laws. You might find it surprising that single women in colonies like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maryland could purchase land, operate businesses, and sue debtors within local jurisdiction, exercising what many considered inalienable rights of economic participation. In 1718, Pennsylvania widow Margaret Shippen managed extensive real estate holdings throughout Philadelphia, demonstrating the substantial wealth accumulation possible under femme sole protections. These property-owning spinsters paid taxes, contributed to colonial economies, and maintained financial independence that their married counterparts legally surrendered upon exchanging vows, creating a paradox where matrimony actually diminished women's legal standing. While the legal autonomy of unmarried women might seem empowering by colonial standards, this same independence rendered them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, particularly when their property holdings, economic success, or social nonconformity threatened community norms. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, you'll find that unmarried women and widows comprised a disproportionate number of the accused, with their financial independence often serving as implicit evidence of supernatural dealings. In Essex County, Massachusetts, women who inherited property or operated businesses without male oversight faced heightened scrutiny, as their economic jurisdiction challenged patriarchal structures. The nullification of a woman's reputation through witchcraft accusations effectively stripped her of inalienable rights to property and life, transferring her assets to accusers or the colony upon conviction or execution. Centuries before colonial authorities targeted unmarried women as suspected witches, the Beguines of medieval Europe established a remarkable precedent for female independence, creating semi-religious communities that allowed women to live outside both marriage and traditional convent structures. These communities, known as beguinages, first emerged in the Low Countries during the 12th century, offering women jurisdiction over their own spiritual and economic lives without requiring permanent vows. You should understand that Beguines maintained inalienable rights to personal property, could leave the community to marry, and supported themselves through textile work, teaching, and caring for the sick. The Council of Vienne in 1312 attempted nullification of the movement, condemning certain Beguine beliefs as heretical. Yet many communities survived this persecution and continued operating throughout medieval Europe for centuries afterward. Although the Beguines demonstrated that women could thrive independently, societies across Europe and colonial America developed systematic methods to punish and discourage women who refused to marry, employing legal penalties, economic restrictions, and social ostracism as enforcement mechanisms. In the colonial Massachusetts, unmarried women faced restricted property rights, as jurisdiction over inheritance often required male relatives to manage estates, regardless of a woman's competence. You'd find that spinster taxes emerged in various European regions, financially penalizing women who remained single past marriageable age. The nullification of certain inalienable rights occurred through coverture laws, which erased a woman's legal identity upon marriage, but paradoxically made remaining single equally disadvantageous. Communities subjected unmarried women to public ridicule, mandatory service in other households, and exclusion from social gatherings where married women held recognized status. By the mid-19th century, demographic shifts in Victorian England transformed these long-standing prejudices against unmarried women into what contemporaries termed the surplus women crisis, a perceived social emergency that sparked intense public debate about female independence. The 1851 census revealed approximately 500,000 more women than men in Britain, creating what reformers and critics alike viewed as a fundamental disruption to social order. You must understand that Victorian society offered limited jurisdiction over their own lives to unmarried women, as marriage remained the only sanctioned path to economic security and social legitimacy. The inalienable rights that men enjoyed, including property ownership and professional employment, faced systematic nullification when applied to women outside matrimony. Writers like William Rathbone Gregg published inflammatory essays in 1862, characterizing unmarried women as national burdens requiring exportation to colonies. While Victorian commentators debated the fate of unmarried women as though spinsterhood represented a novel crisis, history's most powerful female monarchs had already demonstrated that rejecting marriage could serve as a deliberate strategy for maintaining political jurisdiction and personal autonomy. Elizabeth I of England, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, famously declared herself married to her kingdom, understanding that accepting a husband would trigger the nullification of her sovereign authority under 16th century legal frameworks. Christina of Sweden abdicated in 1654 rather than submit to marriage pressures, exercising what she considered her inalienable rights to self-determination. Queen Elizabeth I's strategic refusal allowed her to leverage marriage negotiations as diplomatic tools for decades, maintaining England's independence from Spanish, French, and Austrian influence without ever surrendering her throne to a male consort. Beyond the corridors of royal power, unmarried women in the commercial sphere established their own forms of jurisdiction over industries that conventional wisdom deemed exclusively male territory. You'll find remarkable examples in figures like Madam C.J. Walker, who, born Sarah Breedlove in 1867, built a hair care empire worth over $1 million by 1919, becoming America's first self-made female millionaire without relying on male partnership or inheritance. In 1916, Helena Rubinstein, never legally married during her empire-building years, exercised complete jurisdiction over her cosmetics corporation, which she'd founded in Melbourne, Australia, in 1902. These women claimed inalienable rights to economic participation, effectively achieving nullification of social expectations that demanded female dependency. Their business decisions, financial autonomy, and corporate leadership demonstrated that commercial success required competence, not matrimony. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, unmarried women assumed critical jurisdiction over revolutionary activities that married women couldn't undertake without risking their husband's property, social standing, and legal protections under coverture laws. You'll find that single women like Susan B. Anthony, who remained unmarried specifically to maintain her legal autonomy, could sign petitions, own property used for abolitionist safe houses, and speak publicly without requiring male permission or endangering a spouse's livelihood. During the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, unmarried women exercised their inalienable rights to organize, draft declarations, and challenge nullification of women's civic participation. Single women served as couriers, pamphleteers, and organizers precisely because they possessed independent legal standing that married women forfeited upon matrimony, making them invaluable assets to movements demanding fundamental social transformation. Although religious institutions granted celibate women unique spiritual jurisdiction through convents, holy orders, and consecrated virgin statuses that elevated their moral authority above married women's domestic subordination, these same churches simultaneously condemned unmarried laywomen who rejected matrimony outside ecclesiastical control as threats to patriarchal social order, creating a paradox that persisted from medieval canon law through 19th century Protestant denominations. You can trace this contradiction through the 1563 Council of Trent, which reaffirmed convent life as spiritually superior while declaring marriage a sacrament that all lay people should pursue. Protestant reformers, including Martin Luther, abolished convents entirely after 1517, effectively removing the inalienable rights celibate women had previously claimed. When Protestant reformers eliminated convents as sanctuaries for unmarried women, literary pursuits emerged as one of the few remaining avenues through which women could claim intellectual jurisdiction outside matrimonial control. Writers including Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, and Louisa May Alcott deliberately chose solitude over marriage to protect their creative autonomy. You can observe how Austen, who lived from 1775 to 1817, rejected at least one marriage proposal, recognizing that matrimony would constitute a nullification of her writing career. Dickinson, residing in Amherst, Massachusetts, gradually withdrew from society after 1858, producing nearly 1,800 poems in relative isolation. Alcott, born in 1832, explicitly stated that liberty remained her inalienable right, refusing proposals to maintain financial and creative independence while supporting her family through her literary output. Beyond the literary world, women-only households operated as practical economic arrangements that historians have long overlooked. Census records from the 18th and 19th centuries reveal thousands of women who established shared residences with sisters, cousins, or unrelated female companions to pool resources and maintain independence from male guardianship. These arrangements effectively created a nullification of coverture laws, which stripped married women of their inalienable rights to own property, sign contracts, or maintain jurisdiction over their own earnings. You'll find documented cases in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, where widows and spinsters formed cooperative households that functioned as economic units, sharing rent, domestic labor, and business ventures. These women operated boarding houses, millinery shops, and schools together, establishing financial independence that marriage would have legally transferred to husbands. Primogeniture laws, which prioritized male heirs in the distribution of family estates, created a legal framework that effectively coerced women into matrimony as their primary means of economic survival throughout England and colonial America. Under these statutes, you couldn't inherit your father's land if you'd brothers, regardless of your age or capabilities, leaving marriage as your only path to property ownership. The doctrine of coverture compounded these restrictions as it nullified a woman's legal identity upon marriage, transferring all her property rights to her husband's jurisdiction. Ironically, this system created a paradox where marriage simultaneously offered economic security while stripping you of inalienable rights to your own earnings and inherited wealth. Colonial women in Virginia faced particularly harsh interpretations of these English common law traditions. Although inheritance restrictions pushed countless women toward marriage as their sole economic strategy, a remarkable cohort of female scientists deliberately rejected matrimony to preserve their intellectual autonomy and professional independence during the 19th and early 20th centuries. You'll find that astronomers like Williamina Fleming, who joined Harvard Observatory in 1881, and geneticist Nettie Stevens, who identified sex chromosomes in 1905, maintained jurisdiction over their research trajectories by remaining unmarried. These women recognized that marriage laws effectively meant nullification of their inalienable rights to intellectual property, laboratory access, and academic appointments. Maria Mitchell, America's first professional female astronomer and Vassar College professor from 1865 until 1888, openly advocated for scientific careers over matrimony. You can observe similar patterns among Nobel laureate Marie Curie's unmarried assistants at the Radium Institute in Paris during the 1920s. The Boston marriage phenomenon emerged during the 1870s and 1880s as educated women, particularly in New England's intellectual circles, established long-term domestic partnerships with other women to circumvent the legal nullification of their rights that traditional marriage imposed. You'll find these arrangements most prevalent among graduates of elite women's colleges, including Wellesley and Smith, where financial independence through teaching or writing careers made such living situations viable. Notable Boston marriages included author Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields, who maintained their partnership from 1881 until Jewett's death in 1909. These domestic arrangements allowed you to retain property rights, control your own earnings, and maintain jurisdiction over personal decisions that coverture laws would otherwise transfer to a husband. Society generally tolerated these partnerships as respectable companionship between spinsters. During the mid-19th century, single women who possessed both financial independence and intellectual curiosity began venturing into territories that colonial powers, scientific institutions, and geographic societies had long considered the exclusive jurisdiction of male explorers. These women challenged the prevailing notion that exploration constituted an inalienable right belonging exclusively to men. In 1854, Ida Pfeiffer became the first woman admitted to the Berlin Geographical Society, following her solo expeditions through Iceland, Scandinavia, and South America. Mary Kingsley, travelling alone through West Africa in 1893, collected specimens for the British Museum while navigating regions where European men had perished from disease. Isabella Bird, unmarried until age 50, documented her journeys through the Rocky Mountains, Japan, and Persia, effectively achieving the nullification of gender-based restrictions that had previously barred women from serious scientific fieldwork. Before the Married Women's Property Acts of 1839, 1870, and 1882 established legal frameworks in England and the United States, single women occupied a peculiar position of economic advantage that their married counterparts couldn't claim, as the doctrine of coverture effectively transferred a wife's property, wages, and legal identity to her husband upon marriage. You'd find that unmarried women, known legally as femmes, retained full jurisdiction over their earnings, contracts, and property holdings. This status granted you inalienable rights to conduct business, sue in court, and accumulate wealth without nullification of your legal personhood. In colonial America, single women like Eliza Lucas Pinckney managed substantial plantations and developed indigo cultivation, while widows operated taverns, print shops, and mercantile establishments throughout Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston with complete financial autonomy. While married women artists often faced the nullification of their professional identities through coverture and domestic obligations. Unmarried painters, sculptors and writers claimed jurisdiction over their creative output, financial earnings and career trajectories in ways that fundamentally shaped Western art history. You can trace this pattern through figures like Rosa Bonheur, the French animalier painter who never married and maintained complete control over her substantial fortune, including the Chateau de Bay, which she purchased in 1859. Edmonia Lewis, the African-American and Ojibwe sculptor working in Rome during the 1860s and 1870s, retained inalienable rights to her neoclassical works, precisely because no husband held legal claim to her earnings. These women demonstrated that artistic independence often required personal independence, a correlation that challenges romantic narratives about creative genius flourishing regardless of social circumstances. The devastation of major conflicts fundamentally altered demographic patterns across Europe and North America, creating what historians term surplus women, populations that reshaped social expectations around marriage for decades. After World War I, Britain recorded approximately 1.75 million more women than men, a demographic imbalance that forced society to reconsider the jurisdiction women held over their own economic futures. You must understand that these women, facing the nullification of traditional marriage prospects, claimed inalienable rights to employment, property ownership, and independent living arrangements previously denied to unmarried females. In France, the 1921 census revealed 1.1 million excess women, while Germany confronted similar statistical realities. These demographic shifts compelled legislative bodies to expand women's legal standing, recognizing that spinster status was often circumstance rather than choice. Although demographic realities following major wars rendered marriage statistically impossible for millions of women, society's entrenched attitudes didn't accommodate these mathematical truths, instead perpetuating cruel terminology that framed unmarried women as failures rather than casualties of circumstance. You'd encounter phrases like old maid, spinster, and left on the shelf, each carrying implications of diminished social value and personal inadequacy. By the 1920s, women past 25 without marriage prospects faced systematic social nullification, their jurisdiction over their own lives questioned by family members, employers, and community institutions alike. Victorian-era conduct manuals, still circulating through the early 20th century, reinforced these stigmas by presenting matrimony as woman's singular purpose. The inalienable rights to dignity and self-determination weren't extended to those who remained single, regardless of whether choice or circumstance determined their status. Before society imposed rigid expectations of marriage upon women, religious traditions across medieval Europe offered an alternative path that granted certain females remarkable autonomy, spiritual authority, and freedom from domestic obligations. You discover that anchoresses, women who chose permanent enclosure in small cells attached to churches, exercised remarkable jurisdiction over their spiritual lives, with figures like Julian of Norwich gaining significant theological influence during the 14th century. These religious recluses effectively achieved a form of social nullification, removing themselves from marriage markets and patriarchal household structures through sacred vows. You find that the Church recognized their inalienable rights to solitary devotion, providing them food, shelter, and protection, while demanding nothing beyond prayer. This arrangement, documented extensively in texts like the Ancren Vis from 1225, offered women unprecedented independence within otherwise restrictive medieval frameworks. During the 17th and 18th centuries, widows, spinsters, and abandoned wives established independent households in growing numbers across European and American urban centers, fundamentally challenging assumptions about women's necessary dependence on male guardianship. In Amsterdam, by 1742, female-headed households constituted approximately 35% of all urban residencies, a pattern mirrored in London, Paris, and colonial Boston. You should recognize that these women operated outside traditional male jurisdiction, often running boarding houses, taverns, and small shops to sustain themselves economically. colonial American legal frameworks occasionally granted femme sole status to married women whose husbands had abandoned them, effectively creating nullification of coverture restrictions. In Philadelphia between 1750 and 1775, court records document hundreds of women petitioning for such independent trading rights, asserting what they framed as inalienable rights to economic self-determination. When examining the transformation of educational institutions in the 19th century, you'll find that unmarried women exercised jurisdiction over pedagogical reform in ways that fundamentally altered American intellectual life. Catherine Beecher, who never married, established the Hartford Female Seminary in 1823, asserting that women possessed inalienable rights to intellectual development regardless of marital status. Mary Lyon, another unmarried educator, founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1837, creating the first institution dedicated to providing women with rigorous academic training comparable to men's colleges. These single women rejected the nullification of their professional ambitions, building networks of female educators who staffed schools across the expanding nation. Although romantic narratives often portrayed spinsterhood as an unfortunate fate, many 19th century families exercised deliberate jurisdiction over daughters' marital prospects, sometimes actively preventing marriages to retain their labor and caregiving services within the household. You'll find that parents frequently rejected suitors they deemed financially unsuitable, but economic calculations extended beyond protecting daughters from poverty. Families recognized that unmarried daughters provided essential domestic labor, nursing care for aging parents and childcare for siblings' offspring without requiring compensation beyond room and board. This arrangement effectively nullified a daughter's inalienable rights to choose her own path, treating her labor as a family resource rather than an individual asset. In rural communities particularly, eldest daughters often remained unmarried by family design, their potential marriages sacrificed to maintain household economies that depended upon their unpaid contributions. Because marriage legally transferred a woman's property, earnings, and civic identity to her husband under coverture laws, unmarried women occupied a unique position in 19th century reform movements, possessing legal standing that their married counterparts couldn't claim. You'll find that spinsters like Susan B. Anthony, who never married, could sign contracts, own property, and speak publicly without requiring a husband's permission, making them invaluable to the suffrage movement. Anthony specifically chose to remain single, understanding that marriage would nullify her inalienable rights to self-determination and independent action. Single women collected signatures, organized conventions, and testified before legislative bodies, exercising jurisdiction over their own affairs in ways married women legally couldn't. Their unmarried status became a tactical advantage, transforming personal circumstance into political power during the fight for women's citizenship. Throughout rural communities and urban neighborhoods alike, unmarried women who practiced healing arts maintained a practical autonomy that distinguished them from other female workers, as their specialized knowledge created demand that transcended social stigma attached to spinsterhood. You'll find that midwives like Martha Ballard of Hallowell, Maine, who documented 816 deliveries between 1785 and 1812, operated with jurisdiction over life and death decisions that few men questioned. These practitioners possessed inalienable rights to their earnings, maintaining financial independence through direct payment from families they served. By the 1750s, colonial records show unmarried healers owning property and establishing practices that spanned decades. Their expertise in herbal remedies, childbirth, and illness treatment gave them economic leverage that effectively created nullification of social expectations, requiring male oversight of female activities. Beyond their individual autonomy, many unmarried women who practiced healing and other trades extended their financial jurisdiction over entire family networks, becoming primary breadwinners for siblings, aging parents, nieces, and nephews who depended on their earnings. You'll find that these women exercised considerable economic authority, channeling wages from domestic service, textile work, or skilled trades directly into household maintenance for relatives who couldn't support themselves. In 1850s New England, census records reveal unmarried daughters frequently remained in parental homes not as dependents but as contributors, their wages representing the primary income sustaining aging parents. These women's inalienable rights to their own earnings, established through various Married Women's Property Acts, meant their financial contributions remained under their direct control, preventing the nullification of their economic power through male relatives' claims. While the economic contributions of unmarried women to their families established important precedents for female financial autonomy, the rise of urban boarding houses between 1820 and 1900 created entirely new structures for independent living that hadn't previously existed on such a scale. You'll find that these establishments operated outside traditional household jurisdiction, offering women rooms, meals, and social respectability without requiring male guardianship or family oversight. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, boarding houses became spaces where working women could claim inalienable rights to their own wages and living arrangements. The nullification of earlier social expectations occurred gradually, as thousands of female teachers, factory workers, and clerks demonstrated that independent residence didn't compromise moral standing. The boarding house networks that housed these independent women also funneled them into an expanding urban workforce, where unmarried females had already established footholds decades before organized feminist movements emerged in the late 19th century. You'll find that by 1850, the Lowell textile mills in Massachusetts employed over 8,000 women, predominantly unmarried, who exercised jurisdiction over their own wages and living arrangements. These workers, earning between $3.50 and $4 weekly, challenged prevailing assumptions about female dependency. In 1845, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for 10-hour work days, asserting what members considered inalienable rights to fair treatment. Though legislative nullification of their demands occurred repeatedly, these women demonstrated that economic participation preceded political recognition, establishing precedents that later reformers would invoke. Because unmarried women couldn't rely on traditional family structures for economic security, they constructed elaborate mutual aid networks that functioned as alternative kinship systems throughout the 19th century. You'll find that these arrangements operated outside traditional jurisdiction, creating informal contracts that held no legal standing yet proved remarkably durable across decades. In Boston's boarding houses during the 1840s, single women pooled resources for rent, food, and medical emergencies, establishing rotating savings clubs that predated formal banking access. These networks extended beyond mere financial survival, as members provided nursing care during illness, job referrals through workplace connections, and emotional support that married women typically received from extended family. The inalienable rights these women claimed for themselves, though lacking legal nullification of discriminatory statutes, demonstrated practical resistance through collective action and resource sharing. Against prevailing social expectations that positioned marriage as women's singular destiny, a determined cohort of Victorian-era women deliberately rejected courtship rituals to pursue professional ambitions that society deemed incompatible with domestic life. These women exercised what they considered their inalienable rights to self-determination, challenging the jurisdiction of family and church over their personal choices. In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became America's first female medical doctor, remaining unmarried throughout her career. Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized nursing during the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, explicitly refused multiple marriage proposals, viewing matrimony as a nullification of her professional calling. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross in 1881, similarly prioritized humanitarian work over domestic partnership, demonstrating that meaningful contribution to society extended beyond the confines of traditional Victorian womanhood. While unmarried men of the Victorian era enjoyed social acceptance and even admiration for their independence, unmarried women faced systematic stigmatization that revealed society's deeply gendered expectations regarding domestic roles and personal autonomy. You'll find that bachelors maintained full jurisdiction over their financial affairs, property holdings, and social mobility, while spinsters faced nullification of their perceived value in society's eyes. Throughout the 1800s, unmarried men retained inalienable rights to vote, own property without restriction, and pursue professional advancement, whereas their female counterparts encountered barriers at every institutional level. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 in England, while addressing divorce, reinforced these disparities by codifying different standards for men and women. You'd observe that society celebrated confirmed bachelors as discerning individuals, yet branded unmarried women past 25 as pitiable failures who'd neglected their fundamental purpose. Despite the pervasive stigma society attached to their unmarried status, single women of substantial inherited wealth refused to accept the nullification of their social value. Instead, they exercised considerable jurisdiction over philanthropic movements that transformed education, housing, and welfare throughout the 19th century. You find compelling evidence in figures like Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, who never married and donated over $200,000 to Grace Church in New York during the 1870s and 1880s, establishing her inalienable rights to shape religious and cultural institutions. Sophia Smith, a deaf unmarried woman from Hatfield, Massachusetts, bequeathed her entire fortune of $393,000 in 1870 to found Smith College, asserting that women deserved access to higher education equivalent to men's institutions. These women converted social marginalization into lasting institutional power. The philanthropic achievements of women like Sophia Smith and Catherine Lorillard Wolfe occurred against a backdrop of systematic psychological assault designed to convince unmarried women of their fundamental worthlessness and social failure. Medical professionals, religious authorities, and cultural institutions collaborated in constructing narratives that pathologized female independence as aberrant behavior requiring correction. You must understand that this psychological warfare operated through multiple channels simultaneously, creating an inescapable jurisdiction of social judgment. Physicians diagnosed old maids with hysteria, melancholia, and nervous disorders attributed directly to their unmarried state, while ministers preached sermons warning that spinsterhood represented spiritual nullification. Popular literature reinforced these messages through caricatures depicting unmarried women as bitter, incomplete, and pitiable. The cumulative effect constituted a deliberate campaign to undermine women's inalienable rights to self-determination and autonomous existence. Property ownership fundamentally transformed the legal and social standing of unmarried women in 19th century America, creating pathways to independence that marriage would have legally extinguished. Under coverture laws, a wife's legal identity merged with her husband's, resulting in the nullification of her property rights and economic autonomy. You'll find that single women, classified as femmes sole, retained jurisdiction over their earnings, real estate, and financial decisions. The Married Women's Property Acts, beginning with Mississippi's 1839 legislation and New York's landmark 1848 statute, gradually extended these inalienable rights to wives, though implementation remained inconsistent across states. For unmarried women, property ownership meant access to credit, the ability to sign contracts, and participation in commercial transactions. These legal protections created compelling economic arguments against matrimony that challenged prevailing social expectations. While property rights established the legal foundation for female autonomy, adventurous women soon demonstrated that independence extended far beyond domestic boundaries. Travelers like Ida Pfeiffer, who completed her first global circumnavigation in 1848 at age 50, proved that unaccompanied female exploration wasn't merely possible, but could yield significant contributions to scientific and geographical knowledge. You'll find that these women operated outside traditional male jurisdiction, effectively demonstrating the nullification of social conventions that deemed solo female travel improper. Isabella Bird, travelling through the American West, Asia and the Middle East between 1854 and 1901, became the first woman elected to the Royal Geographical Society. These explorers asserted their inalienable rights to movement and discovery, documenting cultures, collecting botanical specimens, and publishing accounts that challenged assumptions about women's physical and intellectual capabilities in demanding environments. Many unmarried women whom Victorian society dismissed as spinsters actually maintained rich romantic lives that operated beyond the jurisdiction of public scrutiny, engaging in long-term partnerships, passionate correspondences, and committed relationships that defied the era's narrow definitions of acceptable feminine fulfillment. You'll find that these women exercised their inalienable rights to companionship through what historians now recognize as Boston marriages, arrangements where two women shared homes, finances, and intimate emotional bonds. Between 1870 and 1920, such partnerships flourished among educated American women, with notable examples including author Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields, who lived together for nearly 3 decades following Mr. Fields' death in 1881. The nullification of these relationships from historical records occurred systematically, as families destroyed letters and diaries that documented romantic attachments deemed inappropriate for public acknowledgement. Beyond these hidden partnerships, another group of women faced even greater scrutiny under the jurisdiction of moral authorities, single mothers who bore and raised children outside the sanctioned boundaries of marriage. Throughout centuries of Western civilization, you'll find these women navigating systems designed to strip them of inalienable rights, including custody of their own children. In 1576, England's Poor Law Act established parish responsibility for illegitimate children, effectively placing unwed mothers under community surveillance and control. Colonial American courts regularly removed children from single mothers deemed morally unfit, a practice continuing well into the 20th century. Despite facing potential nullification of their parental rights, women like Sarah Good of Salem, Massachusetts, and countless unnamed others maintained households, supported their children through domestic labor, and resisted institutional pressures demanding they surrender their offspring to foundling homes. Because unmarried women faced severe legal restrictions on property ownership and wage earning throughout much of Western history, they've developed remarkably inventive financial strategies to secure economic independence. In colonial America, you'll find spinsters establishing themselves as femmes sole traders, a legal classification granting jurisdiction over their own business affairs, effectively nullifying coverture laws that transferred married women's property to husbands. During the 18th and 19th centuries, unmarried women pooled resources through informal lending networks, purchased property through male proxies, and invested in bonds under relatives' names. The Married Women's Property Acts, beginning with Mississippi's 1839 legislation, gradually extended inalienable rights to property ownership, though single women had already pioneered workarounds for decades. You'll discover these strategies weren't merely survival tactics, but sophisticated economic maneuvers demonstrating financial acumen. While financial independence provided one avenue toward autonomy, literary pursuits offered unmarried women a parallel path to self-determination, granting them intellectual jurisdiction over their own narratives and, crucially, a legitimate means of earning income outside traditional domestic arrangements. You'll find that writers like Louisa May Alcott, who remained unmarried until her death in 1888, transformed solitude into productive creative space, publishing over 30 books while supporting her entire family. Emily Dickinson, secluded in her Amherst home, produced nearly 1,800 poems exercising inalienable rights to intellectual expression without male oversight. Christina Rossetti, choosing spinsterhood over compromising marriages, established herself as a preeminent Victorian poet. These women demonstrated that the nullification of marriage as life's singular purpose opened alternative territories of achievement, where solitary living became not deprivation, but deliberate, artistic strategy. The literary achievements of solitary women represented only one dimension of their broader civic influence, as unmarried women increasingly assumed roles of institutional authority within their communities throughout the 19th century. You can observe this transformation in figures like Dorothea Dix, who never married yet wielded considerable jurisdiction over mental health reform, successfully lobbying state legislatures across the nation between 1841 and 1881. Single women established schools, founded charitable organizations, and administered hospitals without requiring male oversight, effectively demonstrating their inalienable rights to civic participation. In 1853, Antoinette Brown Blackwell became the first ordained female minister in a mainstream Protestant denomination, challenging the nullification of women's spiritual authority. These community pillars proved that institutional leadership required competence rather than marital status, fundamentally reshaping public perceptions of unmarried women's societal value. Despite mounting evidence of women's intellectual and civic capabilities, the 19th century medical establishment constructed elaborate, pseudo-scientific frameworks designed to pathologize female independence and discourage women from pursuing lives outside traditional domestic roles. Physicians wielded jurisdiction over women's bodies and minds, claiming that education and professional ambition would cause brain fever, infertility, and nervous collapse. You'll find that doctors frequently diagnosed unmarried women with hysteria, a catch-all condition attributed to the wandering uterus, which conveniently required rest, seclusion, and abandonment of intellectual pursuits. Dr. Edward Clarke's 1873 treatise, Sex in Education, argued that higher learning would atrophy women's reproductive organs, effectively nullifying their biological purpose. These medical myths, presented as inalienable scientific truths, served social control rather than health, creating institutional barriers that independent women had to overcome through sheer determination. Someone had to preserve the letters, photographs, and genealogical records that documented family lineages across generations, and this responsibility fell disproportionately to unmarried women who possessed both the time and domestic jurisdiction to maintain such archives. You'll find that spinster aunts became the unofficial historians, cataloguing births, deaths, marriages, and property transfers that established inalienable rights to inheritance and social standing. These women maintained correspondence networks spanning decades, preserving documentation that proved legitimacy, citizenship, and familial connections during eras when such records determined legal standing. Their jurisdiction over attic trunks and family Bibles meant they controlled access to information that could validate or nullify claims to estates. Without their meticulous record-keeping, countless families would have lost connection to their ancestral histories, property rights, and cultural heritage. Why have millions of adults across industrialized nations increasingly exercised their inalienable right to establish single-person households, reversing centuries of social pressure that treated solitary living as failure or misfortune? Between 1960 and 2020, single-person households in the United States increased from 13% to 28% of all households, according to Census Bureau data. You are witnessing a demographic transformation where economic independence, particularly among women entering professional careers after the 1970s feminist movement, has nullified traditional expectations of cohabitation. In 2019, the Pew Research Center documented that 38% of adults aged 25 to 54 were unpartnered, compared to 29% in 1990. This shift represents your generation's jurisdiction over personal living arrangements, freed from familial or religious mandates that previously governed domestic structure. Although television and film have always reflected prevailing social attitudes toward unmarried women, the specific characterizations deployed by American media from the 1950s onward reveal a systematic pattern of stigmatization that reinforced cultural jurisdiction over women's domestic choices. You can trace this pattern through shows like Our Miss Brooks, 1952-1956, where Connie Brooks's singlehood was portrayed as a problem requiring resolution through marriage to Mr. Boynton. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you'll notice media began challenging these narratives, with The Mary Tyler Moore Show, 1970-1977, presenting Mary Richards as a fulfilled career woman whose inalienable rights to self-determination weren't contingent on matrimony. This represented a partial nullification of earlier stereotypes, though underlying anxieties about unmarried women persisted in plotlines that frequently addressed Mary's dating life and romantic prospects. Because historical records have systematically undervalued women's unpaid labor, you'll find that single women's economic contributions to American society were often rendered invisible, despite their substantial participation in the workforce, property ownership, and community development. Between 1870 and 1920, unmarried women comprised nearly 40% of the female labor force, working as teachers, nurses, factory operatives, and domestic servants across expanding urban centers. Despite their jurisdiction over personal finances, single women faced systematic nullification of their economic agency through discriminatory hiring practices, wage disparities averaging 54% less than male counterparts, and restricted access to credit. Their inalienable rights to property ownership, established through Married Women's Property Acts beginning in Mississippi in 1839, didn't extend equally to professional advancement or financial recognition. You'll discover their contributions built schools, hospitals, and settlement houses throughout industrial America. The persistent cultural narrative of the miserable, isolated spinster crumbles under historical scrutiny, revealing instead vibrant networks of female friendship, professional collaboration, and intentional community building that sustained unmarried women throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Boston marriages, a term popularized after Henry James's 1886 novel, described long-term partnerships between professional women who shared homes, finances, and social lives. Settlement houses, including Hull House established by Jane Addams in Chicago in 1889, created jurisdictions where unmarried women exercised authority over educational programs, labor advocacy, and immigrant services. These women claimed inalienable rights to intellectual fulfillment and meaningful work, effectively achieving nullification of society's expectations through collective action. Their boarding houses, professional clubs, and reform organizations formed deliberate alternatives to domestic isolation, challenging assumptions that marriage alone provided companionship. Beyond their historical significance, these independent women established precedents that continue to inform contemporary discussions about housing equity, workplace autonomy, and the inalienable rights of individuals to define success outside traditional relationship structures. You can trace direct lineage from 19th century property rights activists to modern equal credit legislation, including the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which prohibited discrimination based on marital status. These historical figures demonstrated that jurisdiction over one's financial destiny required persistent legal challenges and nullification of discriminatory statutes. You witness their legacy in current debates surrounding single-income mortgage accessibility, retirement planning for unmarried individuals, and workplace policies that assume dual-income households. Their documented struggles reveal that independence was never granted freely, but demanded through calculated resistance, strategic litigation, and unwavering commitment to self-determination across multiple generations of reformers. Throughout history, you've witnessed how unmarried women exercised economic jurisdiction over their own lives, accumulated property, and contributed meaningfully to society despite facing systematic nullification of their inalienable rights through discriminatory legislation and social stigma. The spinster narrative, deliberately constructed to discourage female independence, cannot erase centuries of documented self-sufficiency. When you examine the historical record objectively, you'll recognize that autonomous women weren't anomalies requiring pity. They were participants in an ongoing struggle for economic and social sovereignty.